There was a factory in York, England that employed more than a third of the entire city. It produced Kit Kat, Smarties, After Eight, Quality Street, Polo Mints, Black Magic, and Yorkie, all under one roof, all for over a century. The workers had pension schemes, free medical care, and company-built homes long before any of that was legally required. Then, in 1988, a Swiss company offered £2.5 billion and the board said yes. Today, the name Rowntree's no longer appears on a single chocolate wrapper. This is how one of Britain's greatest industrial stories ended. If you're enjoying this so far, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who'd appreciate the story. It takes 2 seconds and it genuinely helps. Joseph Rowntree did not start with ambition for personal wealth. And he was a Quaker, raised in a tradition that treated business as a moral obligation rather than a path to personal fortune. When he joined his brother, Henry, Isaac Rowntree's struggling cocoa and chocolate business in York in 1869, the company had fewer than a dozen employees and a reputation for producing a gummy, low-quality cocoa paste that very few people wanted to buy. Joseph changed that methodically over decades, beginning with the product itself. He imported new equipment from the Netherlands, hired a trained chemist to reformulate the cocoa, and sourced higher-quality beans from West Africa. By the 1880s, Rowntree's had developed a process for producing pure cocoa powder that could genuinely compete with the Swiss and Belgian manufacturers who dominated the British market at the time. The workforce grew steadily from a handful of workers to hundreds, and then to thousands. By 1900, the company employed over 4,000 people in the city of York alone. What separated Rowntree's from the majority of Victorian manufacturers wasn't only the quality of their product. Joseph Rowntree was genuinely uncomfortable with the idea of profit accumulated at the expense of the people who earned it for him. He studied poverty systematically, wrote extensively about its causes, and in 1904 endowed 3 charitable trusts focused on social policy, housing reform, and democratic accountability. Those trusts, funded by the wealth Rowntree's generated, still operate today. His approach to running a factory was a direct extension of those beliefs, and it produced a company that was unusual for its time in almost every respect. If this story is worth your time, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can keep making content like this. Rowntree's did not simply make chocolate in bulk and sell it. They built some of the most recognized confectionery brands in British history through a deliberate and sustained investment in product development, and each major launch reflected a specific understanding of what British consumers wanted at a particular moment in time. Black Magic arrived in 1933, positioned as an upmarket box of dark chocolates aimed at adults. It was one of the first confectionery products in Britain to be explicitly marketed as a gift item rather than a personal indulgence, and the strategy worked well enough to establish the format that premium boxed chocolates still follow today. Quality Street launched in 1936, inspired by a J.M. Barrie play of the same name. The tin of mixed chocolates became a fixture in British households at Christmas and remained so for generations. Kit Kat appeared in 1935 under the original name Rowntree's Chocolate Crisp, before the name changed 2 years later. The brief was deliberately modest, a chocolate bar that a working man could fit in his lunchbox and afford to buy regularly. It became the best-selling chocolate bar in the United Kingdom for several decades running, and for a period it held that title globally as well. But the After Eight launched in 1962 as a premium mint chocolate wafer designed for after-dinner occasions, sold in individual black envelopes inside a dark green box. The packaging was designed to feel expensive, and it succeeded in making consumers treat a box of mints as something worth giving as a gift. Polo Mints came in 1948, Yorkie arrived in 1976, and Lion Bar the same year. Each product came out of a research and development operation in York, where confectionery chemists worked on texture, flavor, and shelf stability with a seriousness that was unusual for a British food manufacturer of the period. York in the 20th century was, in a genuine sense, a company town. Rowntrees did not simply employ a large share of the city's working population, and they shaped the physical and social fabric of York in ways that went well beyond the factory gates and continued to define the city long after the chocolate production itself had been restructured. Joseph Rowntree commissioned the construction of New Earswick in 1902, a model village on the outskirts of York built to house working families in conditions that were meaningfully better than what the standard Victorian housing market offered. The homes had gardens, indoor plumbing, and enough interior space for families to live without the overcrowding that was common in working-class housing at the time. The village included a school, a folk hall, a swimming bath, and a medical practice. Tenants paid rent to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, not to the company, and the rents were set to remain genuinely affordable rather than extracting maximum income from a captive workforce. Inside the factory itself, Rowntrees ran a medical and dental service for employees decades before the National Health Service came into existence in 1948. They operated a pension scheme at a time when the overwhelming majority of British workers had no such provision. They offered evening education classes from the factory site, maintained a library for employees, and employed a workforce welfare officer who was responsible for conditions on the factory floor. By the mid-20th century, the Rowntrees workforce was among the most comprehensively supported industrial workforce in Britain, and the company was regularly cited as a working example of how a private employer could operate with genuine accountability to the people it employed. At its peak in the 1970s, the factory employed around 14,000 people in a city that, at the time, had a total population of roughly 100,000. Almost every family in York had some direct connection to Rowntrees, whether through employment, through a family member who worked there, or simply through the smell of chocolate that drifted across parts of the city on certain days, depending on which way the wind was blowing. By the mid-1980s, Rowntrees was still profitable, still well-regarded, and still operating as an independent British company. However, the global confectionery industry was consolidating rapidly around a small number of very large multinationals. UN Rowntrees, despite its strong brand portfolio, had a stock market valuation that its own management believed significantly underrepresented the true value of the brands it owned. The company had not been aggressive about communicating the strength of its business to investors, and by 1988, it was trading at a price that made it attractive to any large acquirer willing to pay a meaningful premium. In April 1988, a Swiss company called Jacobs Suckered, which owned brands including Toblerone and Milka, began buying Rowntree's shares on the open market without making a formal public announcement. Within a matter of weeks, they had accumulated a significant ownership stake. Nestlé, the largest food and beverage company in the world at the time, then entered the bidding with a formal offer of £2.5 billion for the entire company. Jacob Suchard countered, the two Swiss companies bid against each other through the spring of 1988 for control of a British chocolate manufacturer that had been operating from York since the 1860s. Rowntree's management resisted strongly. They argued internally and publicly that the company was worth considerably more than either offer suggested, and they made serious attempts to find a British buyer who could maintain domestic ownership of the brands. Several large British firms were approached, including Cadbury, but no credible British counterbid came together. In June 1988, the Rowntrees board accepted Nestlé's final offer. The vote was not unanimous. The British government, under Margaret Thatcher, declined to refer the acquisition to the Monopolies and Mergers Commission on national interest grounds. The takeover completed on 23 July 1988. Nestlé's public position at the time of the acquisition was that they would respect the heritage of Rowntrees, maintain employment levels in York, and treat the company as a long-term investment rather than an asset to be stripped. In the short term, some of that held. Kit Kat continued to be manufactured in York, and the facility remained one of the largest Kit Kat production sites in the world for years following the takeover. However, the changes accumulated steadily throughout the 1990s and 2000s in ways that, taken together, fundamentally altered what the acquisition meant for the city and the workforce that had built the brands. There's the Rowntree's name disappeared from all chocolate wrappers by the early 1990s, replaced by the Nestlé name across every product the company had spent over a century building. Quality Street, After Eight, Kit Kat, and all the others became Nestlé products in the eyes of the market, regardless of where they had come from or who had created them. The decision was a commercial one, aligned with Nestlé's global strategy of building a single recognizable parent brand above its acquired product lines. Job losses followed over the subsequent decades, arriving not as a single dramatic announcement, but as a series of restructurings, consolidations, and efficiency programs spread across years. In 2006, Nestlé moved the production of Smarties out of York entirely and transferred manufacturing to a factory in Hamburg, Germany. And the York site that had produced Smarties since 1937 closed that year. Kit Kat's chocolate recipe became a subject of public controversy in 2023 when consumers and food journalists noticed that Nestlé had altered the formulation of the chocolate coating, replacing cocoa butter with a cheaper alternative that changed the texture and taste of the bar. The response from the British public was strongly negative. Nestlé described the change as a minor reformulation. Beyond the products themselves, the social infrastructure that Rowntree's had built around its workforce was gradually disconnected from the company's operations, as the local employer with a community mission was absorbed into a global corporation with no particular obligation to one city in the north of England. The factory in York is still operating. One Nestlé employs several thousand people on the same site where Rowntree's once ran its production lines, and Kit Kat is still manufactured there today. Some of the original Victorian-era buildings remain standing on the site. In that narrow sense, something of what Rowntree's built still exists in physical form. But the company as a distinct entity, as an employer with a social purpose, as a York institution with its own identity rooted in the Quaker values that Joseph Rowntree brought to it in 1869, that is gone entirely. The brands that Rowntree's created across more than a century of product development now function as line items in the portfolio of a corporation headquartered in Vevey, Switzerland. There is no Rowntree's board in York making decisions about what to produce next, no Rowntree's medical service, and no Rowntree's pension fund tied to a locally accountable employer. The story of Rowntree's cites alongside a number of other British industrial histories from the same period, companies that were built over multiple generations, that had genuine roots in specific places and communities, and that were acquired during the wave of global corporate consolidation that swept through British industry in the 1980s and 1990s. What those companies shared was a relationship between business and place that was particular to how they had been built. Rowntree's had been built by people who believed a company had obligations that went beyond the balance sheet, obligations to the workers who made it function, to the city that housed it, and to a broader idea of what responsible business looked like. When Nestlé completed the purchase in 1988, they acquired the factories, the recipes, and the brands. The purpose that had originally shaped all of those things was not part of the transaction. Joseph Rowntree wrote in 1904 that he did not want the institutions he was creating to be, in his own words, mere organizations for the relief of want. He wanted them to address the conditions that produced poverty, not simply its symptoms. That sense of purpose that a business and its founders could carry obligations reaching beyond the current financial quarter was what made Rowntree's something more than a successful confectionery manufacturer. York still carries traces of what was built there. New Earswick still stands. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation still publishes research on poverty and social policy. The factory still makes Kit Kat. But the name Rowntree's belongs to history, and the idea that a company like that could remain rooted in a single community and still compete globally belongs to a period that the events of 1988 helped bring to a close. If you made it to the end, thank you for watching. Please like this video, share it with someone who would appreciate the story, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss content like this. We'll see you in the next one.